everyone, I'm Manar Mohawash, and thank you again for tuning in to Mint Press News' Behind the Headline. We're a citizen-led project created in partnership with Free Speech TV. This show is made possible thanks to the over 300 citizen supporters and several business sponsors. Now, to learn more about them, you can visit our website at mintpressnews.com. Now, let's get behind the headline. The fog of war erupts in the confusion caused by the chaos of war. And in the media, it's an intentional phenomenon that makes it extremely difficult for the public to separate fact from fiction. And while the battles over war narratives evolve, they all have a common goal: to distort reality on the ground. And so is the case for the crisis in Syria and this new Cold War with Russia. But ultimately, a quick glance at history's most notorious propaganda could help us understand just how falsehoods can cause mass hysteria enough for the public to support the next war. Now, take the buildup for President George Bush's support for Kuwait's humanitarian war against Iraq. On October 10, 1990, a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl identified only as Nayara told the Congressional Human Rights Caucus that she witnessed Iraqi soldiers removing babies from incubators and leaving them on a cold floor to die. Now, her testimony was cited by several senators and even President Bush as justification for backing Kuwait in the Gulf War against Saddam Hussein, which erupted just a few months later. However, it was later revealed that this young woman was the daughter of Kuwait's ambassador to the United States, and her testimony was arranged by a PR firm representing a Kuwaiti-sponsored group lobbying Congress for military intervention. More recently, during the Arab Spring uprisings that swept the Middle East in 2011 ahead of the US bombing spree of Libya, Libyan media claimed that Muammar Gaddafi loyalists carried out mass Viagra-fueled rapes and that the Libyan leader had ordered rape as a weapon of war. When a prosecutor with the International Criminal Court opened an investigation into these allegations, it grabbed international headlines, appearing in Al Jazeera, the BBC, and Reuters, among many other outlets. But even as Amnesty International questioned the legitimacy of the allegations, other supposedly humanitarian groups hit a loggerhead on the veracity of the claims. One top UN official said he believed the claims were meant as a scare tactic to invoke mass hysteria, even as another top UN official defended them, all creating a distraction from the war itself. But this mass hysteria became the justification for bombing the hell out of Libya and turning it into a failed state now overrun by groups like ISIS. And today, the fog of war is obscuring realities on the ground in Syria. Major news outlets frequently cite unnamed sources, a convenient way to manipulate public perception. From CNN to Reuters, these outlets are publishing unverified claims and providing minimal evidence to support them, while the public is supposed to drink it all up. Now, the crisis in Syria has attracted international attention and legitimate concern, and the corporate media is using the tragedies of war to push an interventionist agenda while boosting its audience. This push for content, no matter what, has serious consequences. On December 20th, for example, Egyptian police arrested 5 people for making videos they claimed were set in Aleppo, but they were actually filmed at a demolition site in that country. Social media further distorts reality on the ground, presenting a fragmented image of war as the media promotes only those whose accounts that align with the goals of the United States and its allies. Now, the media and public both accept the accounts of the White Helmets as gospel, yet that group, which purports to serve as a volunteer first responders in Aleppo, receives training from British mercenaries and funding from a PR firm tied to George Soros. Not only are the White Helmets making fake videos, but many of the responders have been even exposed as agents embedded with the al-Nusra Front and ISIS, armed and far from being impartial, even a recipient of millions of USAID funding. Whether the White Helmets are the first apolitical first responders they claim to be or not, one thing is clear: the narrative being weaved by and about them and others like them that are embedded with Al-Qaeda have one agenda: support for US military intervention in the war in Syria. Now, take other activists frequently cited by the media, like Bilal Abdul Karim, who is embedded with the Nusra Front, who glorifies suicide bombers, or Lina Shami, the young Syrian woman who promotes sectarian terrorists from Jaish al-Sham, who threatened genocide against religious minorities as revolutionaries on her social media channels. It's time to put a critical lens to the propaganda in the news and social media. It's time to demand more than reporting that toes the government line and makes claims without any real evidence. And here to do just that is noted peace activist and author of War is a Lie and other books is David Swanson. Check it out. Thank you so much, David, for joining me today. I want to begin by talking about the specific coverage that has been coming out of Aleppo, because that reporting has been, a story on its own. Who controls the narrative, controls the public understanding of any war? How has the propaganda worked in the case of Syria? Who controls that narrative?
Well, I think maybe even more so than in some other wars, because there are not embedded reporters with militaries. There are not a lot of reporters from outside the area or reporters at all on the ground. And so people are getting information via social media, from sources that have no more knowledge of the situation on the ground than they themselves do. And of course, the slant of the partisanship and the politics of those producing and packaging the news is enormously shaping what you get. So, of course, you can see through, one story will refer to the liberation by the government and another to, the fall to the regime. And you can interpret the facts as being the exact same thing in both stories. But in other cases, you just cannot tell unless you find some reporter on the ground who you trust whether something has actually happened or not. That there is an incredible push by certain parties, including most U.S. media, to paint the Syrian government as evil to the greatest extent possible. And of course, there's a great deal to work with there. And by others to do the same for other parties. And so you have to take everything with a grain of salt. But here we have, today a ceasefire being announced that looks more serious than past ceasefires. Seems like incredibly good news. But I expect, parties in the U.S. to be spinning it as bad, peace being a bad thing because Russia is in favor of it. So you have to try very hard to sort through and find the facts, because every side is using the incredible suffering as logic for increased militarism by their side. And so you're getting very little reporting that is actually in the interests of peace and de-escalation, and so you get exaggerated suffering on one party, exaggerated suffering by another party, and minimizing the suffering on the opposite sides by those same reports. It's very hard to sort through. But if you begin looking for what might reduce the violence, you can generally decipher what's happening in a broad sense.
And I want to talk about the humanitarian aspect here, because as you know, Syria has been painted as a humanitarian crisis that we need to intervene in. How have so-called humanitarian organizations or unnamed officials played a role in manufacturing falsehoods about the crisis in Syria?
Increasingly, humanitarian suffering is more and more central to the packaging of wars, from the fictional babies taken out of incubators and left on the floor before the Gulf War, to the arming of brutal terrorists by Iraq before the escalation of '03, to the need to rescue people on a mountaintop from ISIS, to the looming massacre in Benghazi prior to the overthrow and murder of Gaddafi. Every single time, and in Syria we have had claims of chemical weapons use by the Assad government that have never been proven. We have had people arrested last week in Egypt for filming, supposed footage of victims in Syria in Egypt. And that has been a phenomenon that we've seen to a far greater extent in this war than any other I can recall. Sheer fictional dramatization of victims. And this recent phenomenon of people sending their final message before they die, and then, of course, not dying in many cases, thank goodness. And groups like the White Helmets, where, of course, there is some good being done, but they're being used to dramatize one side of suffering in order to motivate increased militarism. It's something that it's very hard for people to see through without actually working at it, which is not what U.S. media consumers are in the habit of doing.
Right, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I want to talk a little bit more now about Russia, because Russia has been a stalwart ally of the Syrian government, and they've received a lot of criticism for their role in assisting Syria. Much of the rhetoric we've seen used against Russia is now reminiscent of the Cold War, and even language we've heard recently against the axis of evil. How has the vilification of Russia changed over the years, and how much of it has stayed the same in your opinion?
Even as the Cold War had supposedly ended, and this new enemy was held up, instead of China, which they were planning, it became terrorism. Muslim, Middle Eastern terrorists became the new big enemy. But now it really is been moved back to Russia by the Obama administration, by Hillary Clinton, by Hillary Clinton supporters who are now just openly proclaiming that the strength and merit of their candidate is proven by the fact that she couldn't be defeated without help from Russia. Never mind that there's been no proof whatsoever offered that there was any help from Russia. Never mind that the alleged help from Russia was the alleged revelation that the primary was slanted in her favor by the Democratic Party. And so now we have this intense demonization of Russia that has taken a form today of the Obama White House announcing new sanctions against Russians and kicking Russian spies out of the United States and closing Russian compounds and so forth, on the same day that we have this announcement of a peace agreement in Syria. Most Americans have no idea that the United States has been fending off and sabotaging attempts at peace settlements in Syria from Russia for years now, and that this is another one that may see that same fate if there's not a big push to make it stick and get the United States on board, because ceasing to arm terrorists in Syria by the U.S. government is not part of the agreement and has to be if it's going to work. And so you have now this inclination by Americans to oppose something if Russia's involved, and if Russia and Donald Trump are involved. And it's very, very dangerous that this sort of partisanship is placed ahead of the question of war or peace, which ought to be primary.
And David, now the war in Syria has taken a really interesting turn, because now we see the media openly glorifying and cheerleading for Al-Qaeda to basically overthrow the Syrian government and take power there. Why must we remain critical in our understanding of the Syrian war?
These are essentially Al-Qaeda, essentially an organization that the U.S. government and its sidekick media had demonized for over a decade, being held up as, the enemy of the enemy. And yet this agreement already today is being reported in the U.S. media as well as other media as potentially involving Bashar al-Assad stepping down, as was, of course, part of an agreement reportedly brushed aside without consideration 3 years ago by the United States when Russia put it forward. So, you will end up seeing that, of course, the U.S. aim is not, in fact, just getting rid of Assad, but getting rid of Russia's foothold in Syria. And so this will not please everyone in Washington, but it will please those who have managed to make Assad their primary enemy. And if they can get themselves away from the idea that arming Al-Qaeda is good for that cause, and come to see a nonviolent settlement and humanitarian aid as good for that cause, that's all to the better.
Thank you so much, David. David Swanson, author of War is a Lie and Peace Activist. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yemen has been devastated by asymmetrical aerial bombardment by a Saudi-led coalition, and the war in Yemen, along with a Saudi-imposed blockade, is having disastrous impacts on food and water security. The United Nations reports in October that more than half of Yemen's 28 million people are short of food. At least 1.5 million children are going hungry in the poorest country on the Arabian Peninsula, including nearly 400,000 who are suffering from malnutrition so severe that it's weakening their immune systems. And these Saudi-led attacks continue, striking Yemen's hospitals, which are running out of medicine. All the while, these attacks have continued to receive backing from the United States, Israel, and the United Kingdom since they began on March 26, 2015. Even the New York Times admits that the deadly Saudi project in Yemen couldn't go on without U.S. support. But the Obama administration has said that while they may start halting some arms sales to Saudi Arabia, they're going to push ahead with training the Gulf Kingdom's Air Force to improve targeting. Now, the people of Yemen are without food, water, medicine, and fuel. The death toll in Yemen is so high that the Red Cross has started donating morgues to hospitals. And if that weren't enough, the military campaign has not only empowered Al-Qaeda to step into a vulnerable situation, it's actually made them richer, according to Reuters. Still, the Saudi government continues to block any kind of diplomatic solution in Yemen. Riyadh even threatened to cut funding to the UN over its inclusion on a list of children's rights offenders, effectively weaponizing humanitarian aid. Yet the crisis unfolding in Yemen goes routinely underreported in the mainstream media. Hard-hitting coverage is kept to a minimum by those controlling the narrative, namely outlets loyal to the US and its allies, which are enabling these atrocities. Now, here to discuss the crisis in Yemen and what this war is really about is Catherine Shakdam, a political analyst, author, and director of programs with the Shafakna Institute for Middle Eastern Studies. She's also an expert on Yemen. A Tale of Grand Resistance, Yemen, the Wahhabi, and the House of Saud is her latest book, and in it she explores that real story of resistance against Saudi Arabia's influence on the impoverished state. Check it out. Catherine, thank you so much for joining me today. I want to begin by talking about the backstory to the crisis in Yemen, because the situation there has been rapidly declining. Now much of the population is facing famine that will undoubtedly impact the health and development of the country's youngest generation, but most people don't even know how this conflict got started. Tell us about that.
When it comes to figures and the tally that is coming out, it depends who you're listening to. So, for example, the United Nations has given different figures. For example, they talked about 7,000 dead, and then it went up to 9,000, 10,000, 11,000. But for example, the Shafakna Institute has actually done an independent research working with the Mona Relief Organization, and they have found that so far we have been able to account 15,000 civilian deaths. We're not talking about those who are actually who died in the front line. We're just talking about civilians, and this of course doesn't account for those who died from famine or from I would say collateral damage from the war, for example, lack of medicine and things like this, because in this case, we're talking, maybe 40, 50,000 people. So it really depends how and who you include in those figures. And of course, I think that a lot of it has redacted and kind of manipulated in a way that people don't feel horrified. If you recall just a few years ago, people were talking about 26 million people in Yemen. Now the UN is actually registering 24 million. So if you just do the calculation and the math, you realize there's a kind of like a 2 million deficit. Where those 2 million people went, we're not quite sure. And there's always this fear that they actually, those people are actually dead, but not accounted for. And that's the problem. There's 3 million, internally displaced people right now in Yemen who are living in dire condition. We're talking about living in caves. People's homes and hospitals and schools and mosques have been completely obliterated, and they have literally nowhere to go. So when we talk about the situation in Yemen, I cannot stress enough how dire it is and how unspeakably bleak it is. Saudi Arabia and its coalition has done everything it can to completely obliterate Yemen's civil institutions and Yemen, I would say, as a nation state, because there is nowhere in Yemen you could actually walk into and not face the catastrophe of war. And we're talking absolute devastation. If you look, I think if you wanted to understand what Yemen looks like today, you would have to look at Aleppo, for example, to kind of have an idea of the degree of destruction that Saudi Arabia has rained onto Yemen. And I'm talking about hysterical bombing, obliteration of land, of agricultural land, of hospitals, of, power grid, everything that is actually standing up is now in ashes because Saudi Arabia wished it so. And the world is completely oblivious because Yemen, of course, is sitting under a media blackout, and no one is really interested in hearing what the Yemeni have to say, because Yemen is one of the most impoverished nations in Saudi Arabia, and who cares about Yemen, and who cares about the voice of the oppressed? And I know that it sounds like a cliche, but it is a reality. Yemen is not being heard. People are not giving the courtesy of their own truth and their political future. Yemen has already spoken against this war many times over. They have spoken against those who wish to destroy it, and still the world is not hearing them.
Right, and I'm glad you talked about the dynamics, and it is definitely a complex situation. But like any war, there's always economic interests that feed into the narrative and the agenda of these wars. So, how much of this conflict has to do with oil, for example, or the military-industrial complex and U.S. corporate empire and profits in general?
I do believe that what the US is trying to do is actually spend the Saudi financially by really, selling them as much as possible and kind of setting them up for failure, because they realize that Yemen will be Saudi Arabia, Vietnam. But of course, they're making billions of dollars on the back of the Saudi. And it makes sense for war capitalists back in Washington. They make money. Who cares? They don't really care who dies in the process. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't actually, it's not relevant to them. The blood of the innocent, again, doesn't bother them that much as long as they make, they make them line. Now, the other thing that I believe we need to really pay attention to is the fact that Saudi Arabia has been, promoting Wahhabism in Syria and in Iraq to kind of, propel different radical groups, like Al-Nusra or Boko Haram, for example, in Nigeria and other places in the world. Now, I do believe that it's a form of deflection, I would say, because Saudi Arabia has always had its eye on Yemen. The problem is it couldn't exactly declare war on this one country, because then, of course, we would have, I think, took offense and said, well, you can't exactly declare war on a country just because you feel like it. You would have had to have special, I would say, circumstances kind of be set up for the world to look away. And of course, with Syria and Iraq, the world is literally looking away and is more preoccupied with what is happening with Daesh than it is about Yemen, because again, who cares about Yemen? The problem with Yemen, that it might be most, the poorest nation in Southern Arabia, it nevertheless sits at a very key strategic crossroads in terms of, geopolitics, and it's sitting atop the world oil route. Why is this important? Well, essentially because if Saudi Arabia was actually to take control of Yemen, then they would have a monopoly over all the, natural resources of the world. And we all know that it would essentially mean that Saudi Arabia would be able to dictate certain agenda to Western powers, but not just Western powers, I would say the world entirely. So you would, if you can kind of make a correlation, if you look at how, the UN was actually blackmailed by Saudi Arabia earlier this year, you can only imagine what the kingdom would do if it was given, the key to the world oil route, and how very much of tyranny could be over world politics. Now, I very much doubt that the US is not aware of this reality. I think that they do understand this. But what they're doing is actually spending Saudi Arabia the same that they spent Iraq, if you recall, when they decided to fund Saddam Hussein's war against Iran, before they actually flipped against his regime. I think that we really need to kind of look into history and understand that, those kind of games that are being played today, those alliances that we see shaping, are not forever. That we need to kind of look past short term and understand that the Saudi are being set up. They are actually well overdue for a revolution. They have, today is like 53 or almost 54 billion dollar deficit. They can't continue to fund war. They can't continue to, silence the world by throwing billions of dollars at various parties. Something's going to have to give. And if I would say Syria is anything to kind of, judge by, Yemen is set up, will be victorious, because the Yemeni people have no choice but to defeat Saudi Arabia, because otherwise it's actually the death of them, quite literally. They understand that, and so they will be fighting. Now, the problem is they are standing by themselves, because other countries such as Iran and Russia, for example, are already politically invested in Syria and in Iraq, and they can't possibly take a chance on Yemen now, because it would be too, they would overspend politically, and so they had to make a choice. But again, I think that Saudi Arabia was actually planning on this, which is why it first set up Syria and Iraq as the main war theater in the Greater Middle East, so that the people, first of all, powers would not invest in Yemen. Second, media would not look at Yemen, and that people would maybe not pay attention to what it is that they're trying to do. which is essentially take control over Arabia to then propel, this kind of hegemonic Wahhabist agenda. And I think that we need to really pay attention to this. You need to understand what it is that is coming out of the mouth of Saudi clerics in Saudi Arabia. We never really listen to what it is that they say and the kind of idea that they're promoting, and that they're promoting not only in their country, but outside. Because, in England, for example, 90% of all the most Islamic centers are being funded by Saudi Arabia. So if you imagine what Wahhabi, what Daesh militants are saying, for example, in Syria and Iraq, you have to understand that the same narrative is being played out in the US, in the UK, in France, and other countries across the world. We need to ask ourselves the question, do we really want to look at Yemen and not understand that what is happening in Yemen could happen anywhere else in the world if given the chance, if we allow this to continue to do what it is that they do today?
And Catherine, there's obviously a major media blackout on the crisis in Yemen, unlike other crises that we see constantly being covered, like in Syria or elsewhere. How can we disrupt the mainstream media blackout on Yemen and help mobilize action against U.S. involvement, specifically for their direct role in basically allowing this conflict to even happen?
Yemen is not on. It has nothing to do with Iran. We need to stop, giving into those labels and to try to actually look at countries and understand that if we claim ourselves, we claim democracy for ourselves, we claim freedom for ourselves, can we please give other people, other nations the same courtesy? This is all the Yemeni are asking for. They're asking for political self-determination. So we need to kind of up our high horses and stop judging them on account of their poverty or maybe the fact that they're not Western as we would like them to be. Those people are actually entitled to their history and their identity. We have to respect this. If we're actually serious about democracy and international law, we're talking about respect today. But respect comes by respecting the truth. Yes, entitled to its truth. We ought to listen to its people and our perpetual kind of, I would say, over analysis where we're actually speaking over the Yemeni people. They are entitled to speak up and we need to listen. When we do this, I think that dynamics will change.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. Catherine Shekdam, author and expert on Yemen. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Well, thank you again for joining me today. Make sure to tune in next week for another dose of real news. In the meantime, the conversation continues on Facebook and on Twitter at Minar, MUH. See you then.